Well, good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for coming here and welcome. For the ones that it's your first time here, this is one of the breakfasts that DigitalES, the Spanish association that represents the technological industry, makes once per month. This is a think tank, this is a debate where we try to meet technological issues with humanistic and political and social issues, sorry for that are on the table now. Today we are very honored to have among us Janka Oertel. Let me read briefly her bio. So Janka is the director of the Asia program. She previously worked as a senior fellow in the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States Berlin office, where she focused on transatlantic China policy, including on emerging technologies, Chinese foreign policy and security in East Asia. Prior to joining this institution, she served as a program director at Corber Foundation Berlin's office. Janka holds a PhD from the University of Jena. Her dissertation focused on Chinese policies within the United Nations. She has published widely on topics related to security in the Asia-Pacific region, Chinese foreign policy, 5G and emerging technologies, and United Nations peacekeeping. Today, since our speaker is from Germany, we are going to do this breakfast in English, as you have realized already. So, Janka, thank you very much for being here among us. Thank you very much to the ECFR. It's really, we are very happy to have this collaboration with us, and thank you very much, Nacho, for making that possible. And we are going to follow the Chatham House rules, which means that everyone here can say what has been said here, but no one can say who has said that. So thank you very much for that, and Janka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the great cooperation. We at ECFR are enjoying that very much as well. It's my very first time in Madrid, so it's very exciting. I've been here since yesterday and have been constantly speaking. So what we've decided to do is that I won't speak to you for like 45 minutes and then there's question and answers, but rather keep it a bit shorter and have time for a real conversation, because it's such a wide topic, there's such an array of things on the table, and it's sometimes hard to know where are your interests, what do you really want to know, and I'm happy to be there for all the questions. And when I don't know the answer, I will just say I don't know. So that I think can also work. So I think the topic that we have kind of framed, how we have framed this conversation, saying, are we at a crossroads when it comes to technology cooperation? What we're seeing in the geopolitical space at the moment is quite an important question to raise at the moment. I think I would start out with saying a few words about the 5G conversation that we are having. Maybe starting out with why we are having a debate about 5G at all. One can say that we should have had a debate about 3G and 4G as well, but we haven't had it in continental Europe at least. So last year at the Munich Security Conference in 2019, when Mike Pence got on stage and basically demanded of European allies to ban Chinese vendors from the emerging 5G infrastructure, there were a lot of politicians around Europe saying, what is 5G? You know, do we have to be worried about that? Is that already happening? Is that something that we didn't notice? And I'm jokingly saying this, but there was a lot of confusion about, okay, well, what does that mean? He's saying it could impede our military cooperation? How? Where? You know, a lot of questions that arose. But because it was so forcefully pushed by the United States, it was something that then really kind of emerged as a conversation in every single member state. Say, okay, we need to talk about this. We need to understand what's going on. And one can say that except for the United Kingdom, which has had this conversation since 2010, none of the other European countries were prepared for the conversation, had really had that conversation in 3G and 4G infrastructure. So we're looking at very, very different markets. Because the US had that conversation in 2010 as well, the existing infrastructure really doesn't have a lot of Chinese kit in it. You have smaller rural providers that have some Huawei technology, some CTE technology, but most of the US telecoms operators are not operating with Chinese technology as it is. So for them to go for a 5G rollout not with Chinese vendors wasn't such a far step. It wasn't such a difficult decision. So the decisions taken at the US government level didn't have a big effect on the economy. Now the picture is completely different in Europe, where there's a lot of dependence on Chinese kit. Margins are low for operators. There's a lot of operators in the market. Therefore, the incentive to buy as cheap as possible is relatively high. And Chinese companies have been very, very forthcoming in providing good prices and providing decent kit. And providing good service and operating in like the regulatory framework that we have. So there was really nothing that Europeans thought were wrong with this. But why does this change for the 5G conversation? Well, because it's a different kind of technology. Because it will in the future enable technologies that are much more deeply ingrained into what we are and how our societies are going to be governed. As you all know, from like biotechnology then to telemedicine, remote surgeries, autonomous vehicles, you name it. We're not there yet. This is going to take a while, but quite frankly, this is something that will be much more strategic, and it's a different kind of infrastructure that we're looking at. So all of a sudden it matters, where does it come from, the technology? And that's really not something that we had debated before either. It was relatively neutral in that sense. Was it good technology? Was it not good technology? And it matters that it comes from China. Why does it matter that it comes from China? Everyone's producing in China. We get a lot of stuff from China. Why does all of a sudden matter that 5G technology comes from China? Well, to state something super obvious, but I think it needs to be said, because China is an authoritarian state. And China has changed over the past, let's say 8 to 10 years, relatively massively in the way it is progressing. There's a significant turn towards a more assertive, towards a more aggressive stance, and towards greater control, towards more authoritarianism and not less, towards more market control and not less, towards less access for other companies and not more, which others would demand. So all of a sudden, this Chinese player has changed. Since the financial crisis also, there was a tendency within China to be more independent from the world, because obviously anything that, any global shocks, once you're interdependent with the global markets, have an effect on your country. But when you're the Communist Party and you're dependent on stability for the stabilization of your own rule, that's an external element that can become problematic because it can destabilize your own governance. So there was a tendency from at least since 2008 to become a lot more independent. So if we want to talk about decoupling later a little bit and the fragmentation of the market, this is not necessarily something that the Trump administration has started. This has been there quite a while, and it has actually emanated a lot from Beijing. It also matters where these technologies come from, because we're going to see a much more software-based technology. So it's not a piece of like a pen that you can buy in China and then you can import it to Europe and then you can screw it apart and you can look at it and you can see what it is and it will stay the way it is. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be regular software updates, so that pen is going to change its shape and form and color. And of course it is a difference whether software updates are going to be uploaded from Shenzhen or from Stockholm. And I think to just realize that and to realize that trust all of a sudden becomes an issue is very important for the conversation. There's been a huge discussion about China's national security laws and how that will affect this, because effectively China's new national security laws require every Chinese and Chinese company to collaborate with the services if asked for, and to provide information if asked for. And there has been this huge debate of whether they will actually be asked or whether not. I find that quite a proxy conversation, because quite frankly, if you don't have the rule of law in the country, then it's a bit futile to debate the legal surroundings. A lot of lawyers have made a lot of money of kind of interpreting the Chinese national security law, where in the end, this is just basically writing out, which was implicitly understood from the start, that if the authoritarian state asks something of you, then you will have to deliver. So I think it's not so clever to talk about that law all the time, because that law could change tomorrow. It would not change a thing about the situation. It would not make any difference at all. And I think that's really important to understand, because these are the systemic differences that we're talking about. So where are we in the 5G debate in Europe at the moment? Well, you can spend like 5, 6, 7 hours talking about this probably. So give me just a very brief overview of this. I just came from London yesterday, where we had a long conversation as well. The UK has made a very, very complex decision, one that is underrated, I think, in the complexity, in the talking about it. So the talking points that came out of the UK decision were, so they're allowing Huawei in 35%. Well, it's not that easy. They are the restrictions or the criteria that have been found have to be kind of understood in the right way, because it is a very complex network infrastructure and it's a very complex navigation that the UK security services have proposed. What we are going to see is, first of all, since 2018, ZTE, the Chinese state-owned enterprise that is also providing like fully fledged 5G solutions, has been banned in the UK completely. Second of all, Huawei has been identified as a high-risk vendor by the security services. There's a nice explanation of why they think it's a high-risk vendor and why they think it's a problem that needs to be mitigated. At the same time, the 35% in the radio access network that have been granted to the operators where they can use Huawei Kit are a mitigation criterion. It's a risk mitigation criterion, not a diversity criterion. I think that's also really important. They're not saying, we need 35% to make the network diverse. It is, we cannot have more than 35% because otherwise it becomes an unmitigatable risk. And I think that's really important to kind of get that framing right, because that in the shortened version of the conversation that we're having here, sometimes in the press and sometimes in the media, especially in Germany at the moment, that kind of shifts the notion. It also has a huge degree of control that is required from the operators and from the regulators that is kind of mounted on top of these requirements. I don't think that, and I can only speak for Germany, that we would be able to have the same kind of control with the existing kind of regulatory and security infrastructure that we have. There's 10 years of experience of working in the Huawei Cybersecurity Center between the UK security services and Huawei. There's 10 years of experience in kind of thinking about this. It's going to be really hard to condense that in just a few months' time and to figure out a way to do this in other European countries as well. Just as a as a side note, I think the UK case is just a little bit special. I'm not saying it's a very clever decision, because I really have no clue how they're going to operationalize this, how in the end they're going to control for those 35%. Are you going to have a mapping then in the end? Is every base station going to be mapped somewhere out? Will this be in London? Will this be outside of London? All these questions of how exactly is this going to look like have not been fully answered. There's a huge debate in the parliament in the UK as well about these questions, whether that is actually a good idea or not a good idea. So we're not done with that conversation in the UK as well. But it remains a relatively unique European situation. In Germany, we're at the moment at the stage that all the parties have positioned themselves strongly or not so strongly, because the debate had moved from a very technical conversation that was taking place between the ministries and the regulating agencies and security services to a huge, broad public fight in Parliament, which is fantastic. Because I like democracies and I like to have these conversations out in the open. I think it's very, very important that we are debating what kind of role, how a relationship with the US and with China is going to look like in the future, because it's going to have an effect on the very basis of our lives, and very deep. It's going to change the way we live, potentially, how the structures are going to change around us. So I think that it was well worth to have that conversation. But now we need to get to a conclusion at some point. So we've been dragging this out for a long time, and because the parties have had such a hard time to also come to conclusions within themselves, and because we have a relatively fierce opposition from the German Chancellery and the Economics Ministry, and a different position in the Foreign Ministry and in the security agencies, there's an inter-ministerial conversation going on that is usually not helpful for a speedy process. That's the problem that we're facing at the moment. So we need two new laws. We need an update to the telecommunications law and an update to the IT security law. And these two, those updates need to be presented to Parliament. They haven't been presented so far, so we're in that stage. We're waiting for these updates to be presented so that they can then be discussed in Parliament and decided upon in Parliament. I think that's, it will take another few weeks, hopefully only weeks, hopefully not months. But I find it a little bit ironic that we're having a long conversation about whether there are going to be delays in case Huawei or ZTE or high-risk vendors in general are going to be banned from the networks. But we have zero problem with the fact that we're dragging a political conversation out for months and months on end. So I think that the irony of this has to be also underlined a little bit. We're not making it easier for the vendors at the moment because you can't really, because the conversations are so much up in the air, can't really make a decision on what to buy. And that means that the vendors are going to have problems. This morning the news came out that Nokia is having serious financial problems and is rethinking potential like sellouts, restructuring, etc. So we can talk about this for a long time, but in the end, maybe our European tech champions become the victims of that. What are the implications for our relations with the US and China? Transatlantic relations are already at a low point. It's really hard to get them worse. Speaking from Berlin, at the moment, if you want to sell anything as like a corporation with the US, and as because we have this great alliance, people are looking at you like, oh no, don't start this. This is a bad idea. Anything that kind of sort of smells like transatlantic cooperation has a iffy feeling to it, and people really don't want to be close to it. But that's not helping for the conversation because it distorts the way we think about things. It distorts the way we kind of frame the problem, and it leads us down a road that is very dangerous, and that's the equidistance conversation. There's the US here and there's China here, and we need to be sort of in the middle and keep equidistance with both sides. Well, that's not where we are, and that's not where we should be, because on the one hand we have human rights violations of epic proportions in an authoritarian state that is building a digital authoritarian superpower. And on the other hand, we have the United States, which is our most important security ally. We trust them with their nuclear weapons on our territory. I mean, we need to kind of get this right again, where we stand in the conversation, despite all the differences, despite all the conversations between, the difficulties that we're seeing with this administration. This is still where we are in the conversations and where our values should be. How does it affect maybe we can go into decoupling a little bit later in the conversation and how the fragmentation will look like. How does it affect our relations with China? That's a bit more difficult to say. So what we can say empirically is that those countries that have made decisions relatively quickly have had relatively limited fallout, relatively on the 5G decision, I mean. But what we can also say empirically is that we have seen China use economic coercion, coercive measures, when for political problems. So if something is not going well in the economic relationship or in the political relationship, China's using increasingly its economic power to enforce change upon the other player. And that's something that it can't be taken for granted, but obviously it's in the heads of our policymakers as well, thinking about, okay, this is, for Germany, it's our most important bilateral trading partner. What does that mean in the future? If we have a worsening of the relationship, how many jobs will that cost? What will that do to populism? These are all interconnected questions, and it's not easy. No one's saying that this is an easy decision. The question is, though, how do you, if you are already dependent, is it a clever move to become more dependent? And I think this is where, in that conversation we are, how can you phase out? How can you end past dependencies? How can you create greater diversity and still maintain an interesting partner? Because also, let's face that, we're important trading partners for China as well. I think we need to understand that our trading relationship with China is a mutual one, and so we can use that as leverage. In this entire conversation that we're having at the moment, EU cohesion is absolutely key. That's easier said than done, and we all know how difficult it is to create joint European solutions at the moment, but I think the 5G case has shown us that every time when we make individual decisions, we can only lose, because everyone that sticks their head out just a little bit may feel the brunt first. So collectively finding good solutions, and what we've seen from Brussels in terms of the risk assessment and the toolbox that came out were really good documents, were really properly, very well done analysis based on what came from the member states. It's a synthesis of what came from the member states. So I find that quite interesting that we have a very, very solid response from Brussels in an area where unfortunately they don't have that much competency to regulate it, but the initial input is very good. And it's something that all of the Europeans can base their actions on. But obviously the ball is in Berlin's court to make a move, because this is what leadership in the end is all about. And I know that a lot of eyes are looking towards Berlin and how this decision is going to be taken there. And it will require some sacrifices, and it will have costs. I think that anyone that says whatever way this decision is taken will have no costs. There is an easy solution. There is that magic silver bullet out there somewhere, is fooling themselves, because every decision will have costs affected to it. We have an interesting year ahead of us. 2020, in 2019, we saw a change in tone from the European Union towards China, stronger words. We had the word systemic rival that came out of Commission documentation. And 2020 is going to be more about cooperation. There's a lot of summits coming up. There's a lot of meetings coming up. We have the coronavirus at the moment that forces also a lot of cooperation to avoid a global pandemic. So the tone of the conversation is shifting again, and we're not set yet where these things are moving. But if we go beyond the 5G case in the area of artificial intelligence, etc., we are at a crossroads to say who is going to set the rules by this is going to be governed. And if we don't find coalitions that kind of have the same understanding of a rules-based order that we have, it's going to be very, very difficult to find a good spot in a world that is increasingly fragmented, where you increasingly have various digital spheres of influence, and that's a place that Europe wants to and needs to avoid. And there are partners out there, including the United States, but definitely the United Kingdom, definitely Japan, definitely Australia, Canada. These are all, I would say, middle powers struggling with the questions of how do we get this right in the new digital order, in the new technological order of the world. And this is exactly the point where we are, and where the 5G conversation basically is a prism through which we can look at this, but the decisions will be, the lessons learned that we can take away from this will have a greater effect on the rest of the conversations and the rest of the topics that are out there as well. Maybe I'll leave it at that, and we can have a few questions as well.
Thank you very much, Janka. It was so interesting to hear you. In Spain, you know that we have collaborated in this document related to this response in Brussels, and our industry has made the point on that, and we agree that the cybersecurity toolbox that was issued at the end of January was a very good document, with strong recommendations, actually, that is going to be maybe hard to implement, and it's going to represent a cost to the telcos, which, as you say, the margins are quite low, and this is a very difficult time for them. So we have to see how it's going to be implemented. So let's see. But we are confident on that. So now, if you want to ask questions, please raise your arm, say your name and the institution that you represent. So there is a question at the end of the room.
Thank you. My name is Ángel Álvarez, and I do not represent anyone because I am retired. I'm retired from the Technical University of Madrid. I thank you very much for your illuminating discussion. I have 2 points only. One of them is precision. The document of last year from the European Union talks about China being a systemic rival in promoting alternative forms of government only. And people have extended that to systemic rival in every aspect. That is a major mistake all newspapers have made. And then, talking about the wiretapping in Spain, I only have one question. How do we defend ourselves from the wiretapping in Spain from the United States, from our friend? Because this is what we have been suffering most up till now. NSA, National Security Agency. They have been spying on Spanish companies to take contracts away from us, and that is already proven. I mean, they know everything about us. They are in our blood. They have all our data. How can we defend ourselves from that? Because this is the real problem nowadays.
Well, to help Janka, I would say that there is a regulation regarding personal data, which is GPRD. So this is the best response to that.
But I'll add a little bit to
Sorry,
that.
so Janka. Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. I've conflated it as well. So the Commission communication said very clearly that China is a systemic rival, but it's also a partner and an economic competitor. And it's a strategic partner for us in global governance issues. Climate change is always named. That's a tricky one, actually, to be cooperative in. At the moment, we're not seeing a lot of a cooperative agenda emanating from China on the issue, but that's definitely one where we need to seek cooperation, because otherwise it's not going to work. There are other issues where I think there's a great potential as well, and that one is global pandemics, where cooperation needs to happen, and arms control is one where we also need to get China on board, no matter what. So that cooperative agenda needs to remain in place, and I think it was quite revolutionary of the EU Commission to come up with this kind of trifecta of things that China is, because it is all these things at the same time. It needs to be a cooperation partner on some issues. It will be our economic competitor, because we compete over markets. Our companies compete over markets and compete over shares. That's when we start to talk about the fairness of rules and level playing fields, etc. But it remains a competition, and I think that President Juncker once said it really well. He said, "Well, be happy. We call you a competitor. That means we think you're equal, and we're pretty good at economics. So we're pretty good at trade." So I think I was rephrasing that a little bit. He wasn't saying it like that, but I think it's the idea behind this to say we are not afraid of competition. We have great companies, we have great technologies. We have been trading powers for a long time. We're not afraid of competing with China, but we don't like the market distorting effects that state subsidies have. We think that trade should be governed by rules. So we can nudge, hopefully, China, at least in our domestic market, to play by the rules. And that's the idea behind the competitor idea. And the systemic rival is one that we don't have any other country that we label a systemic rival. It is because Beijing presents a very, very new set of challenges. They are a communist power. Well, we've had that before. They have a communist party. We had that before. They're an authoritarian power. We have had that before. But they're a capitalist authoritarian power. They're like us. And that makes it a lot more difficult to deal with. And I think that's where the question of how do you, if you have a powerful, economically powerful state with a big population and huge potential that is able to design the rules in the world in its favor, then it becomes a systemic rivalry. It becomes a competition about who sets the rules. And we can see that in multilateral organizations already. We can see that on all kinds of fronts already. And that's where we need to find our own response to this with the US where it's possible, and without the United States where necessary. Maybe a word on the NSA. I think we're the perfect country in Germany to talk about that, because our chancellor has been spied on and we didn't like it at all. This was one of the low points of the transatlantic relationship. And whereas the chancellor had taken it with quite some humor, and actually the measures afterwards taken, for example, Cisco routers, etc., and nothing was done about that, because we really apparently didn't care that much. Yes, there will always be espionage from the US, from China, from Russia, from us. That will always be the case. The question is, can you find how can you defend yourself better? So after the NSA scandal, we've gotten better at cyber defense. How can you preempt a certain amount of action? That's when you talk about cyber offensive capabilities as well. That's something that's more difficult for Europeans to talk about, especially for Germans. We're not really in that space yet. But of course, this is something where in the future, if you want to preempt something, and this is where you have to talk about regulation as well. Today, it was announced that there's going to be the first case brought about the EU cyber espionage regulation. So basically saying that there's going to be the first charges against Chinese and Russian actors that have launched major attacks on Europeans. The question of our data within US platforms is one that is actually trying to be, where the GDPR is trying to govern that, but where we still don't have the rules set, where we don't have the framework yet. But that's one which we need to address. And this has been, I think, a conversation that is not only going on here, this is also a conversation that's going on in the United States. Yeah. And I find that quite striking during the campaigns that we're seeing at the moment in the presidential campaign, that the easiness with which one would give private data to private companies that can then rule the world with that amount of data, that's gone. Those days are not there anymore. There's a lot of questioning within the US society as well, whether that is actually a good idea or whether regulation is actually something that needs to happen in these spaces. And you even have the heads of the big companies basically saying, we need regulation, please put chains on us because we can't handle this anymore. So I think we are at a moment where this is changing, but I think your point is absolutely right. If we can't trust our friends, then that's a problem. But if we know that we can't trust our friends already in this, it would be almost insane to assume that we could trust China. That is, I think, in just a logical consequence of a system that is so different from ours, is like the logical deduction of that. It would be very, very weird if it would be the other way around. I'm not saying it's great that the NSA is spying on European companies or on European governments, but that we need to mitigate that. But I think to assume that wouldn't come from a different direction as well is not that's just not the case. We see the same kind of, maybe a little less sophisticated, but yeah, we see the same kind of attacks.
Thank you so much. Please.
Thank you very much. I would like you to help us. Thank you. I would like you to help me in the first place.
If you don't mind to say your name.
Sorry, I'm terribly sorry. Pilar Mendez, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I would like to ask your help to break myths. There's a lot of, I don't know if they're wrong or right, ideas that I personally, as I'm not a technician, sometimes I think I understand things, but I'm not really sure where I'm understanding the full dimension of things. Right, for instance, with these things of espionage, really, as far as I understand it, I don't think that's the real issue. Once you understand, or the myth with the proofs, there are no proofs. Well, once you understand what 5G is all about, that 5G will enter in the heart of our industries, economies, society, political system. 5G will also be a means for our democracy to develop. Then you understand that the risk here is not about espionage. That is peanuts, really. The risk here is about sabotage. 5G will determine whether water will come out of the tap of your house or not. So if a company, I don't care whether it is Chinese, American, or wherever it comes, controls whether water comes out of the tap of your citizens, you need to worry. And so with this comes the question of the European institutions have talked about autonomy, strategic autonomy of the EU. Okay, I need to know what that means really. We need to define that. There's been a lot of talk about European champions, competence, industrial policy. What is end destination? Because I think that we don't know what the end destination is, so that we know how to go there, we first need to know where are we going to. And then the second myth I would like you to explain to us is this myth with the core and the edge. As far as I've understood it in my small, I'm not a technician, but I think there's no difference. Or if there is a difference, the technological upgrades or breakthroughs that will happen will be in such a short time that it doesn't make any difference. But I'm not sure, really, I'm not sure. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much. The disclaimer on this is, I'm a China expert. I've been working on China and Asia for a long time. And when the 5G conversation started, I received phone calls and someone asked me, yeah, the 5G question here. And so, yeah, but I'm a China expert. Well, there's a lot to do with Chinese companies and you can say something about this. And I was, okay, well, I'll read into this. And then I was digging deeper and digging deeper and digging deeper. And 4 months later, I emerged after a couple of visits to tech companies and a lot of consultations with friends at other think tanks that were like, Janka, I'm a tech expert, I'm not a China expert. This seems to me like a political question. So we all had that kind of same problem because it doesn't fit into one nice little box. It has a political overlay, it has a geopolitical overlay, and has a very technical dimension to it. And I think there are things that can be done on a technical level, and there are things that are just political questions that you cannot regulate or cybersecurity away. You know, they are going to be there and they are going to exist. So that as a disclaimer on top of this, I think that's very important. And I have very much tried, in saying that to my colleagues here, tried to play C-3PO from Star Wars, so like the communicator between robots and people, because all of the tech experts talk a language that it's just really hard to understand sometimes. So I've been trying to understand it and then communicate it in easier words to others. I hope I'm not making any translation mistakes. That's like always a very important aspect here as well. So I agree with you fully. The question that we're talking about is not espionage and not only espionage. Espionage is possible in every system. That's not vendor specific. Now, it makes it easier if you know the system, but that doesn't mean it's impossible in others. So for me, it's one of those, if you have a wide open front door, close it. Maybe then you don't have to worry about that one anymore. You can worry about all those little areas, all those holes that you have anyway. But that's one aspect of this. Really important to say, espionage will be possible whatever we build. Sabotage. Also sabotage will be possible whatever system we build, but that really becomes a lot easier if you control the software updates. So yes, but I find it also is very important to underline that world where all of these things are going to be controlled by 5G, that's still a long way down the road. We're not there yet. That's a couple of years that we're going to need to wait until that happens, if it ever fully materializes. A lot of the standards haven't been defined yet. A lot of the applications that will run on this are not even thought of yet. So yes, because we're building infrastructure that also will have probably like the next 20 years in our systems, we need to think about all of this and we need to think about the potential outcome, but we don't know about a lot of the things that could actually be there. The question of strategic autonomy and what does it mean? It sounds sort of good, right? We'll just be autonomous. We'll just do this on our own. Well, it really doesn't work like that in a globalized world anymore. But what do you need to do to have the strategic capacity to act? What do you need to be able to do to kind of leave decision rooms for you to end dependencies? I think that's the question that we need to look at. And the bad news here is 5G is the easy case, because we have 2 European companies that can provide fantastic, technologically advanced, great kit. We could actually just say we want a European solution and we could do it. We cannot do that in AI. It will be a lot more complicated. So, and if we struggle so much to get this done in a case where we actually have a European option, it's going to be much harder on all other questions as well. And I don't have an answer of what we should do in each of these fields, but I think that we need to take the lessons learned from this process very seriously and think about what are smart industrial policies that do not destroy our markets, that do not destroy the general idea of having a free and open market that is trading, that is not government funded fully, because that's a very important lesson. You cannot out-China China. They have more money. In the end, they can throw money at a problem and they can target and they can control the economy in a way that we never can or we don't want to. And I think that's a very important point, that we don't want to become China on the way. So I think this is a fine-tuning between decent and clever investments in research and development, clever investments and support for companies. But in the end, it will depend also on just providing the level playing field. Companies want to compete on the basis of fair rules. And if we haven't set rules and criteria for actors outside of the EU that are playing in our market, because it's wide open, and we have no opportunity for our companies to play on the huge lucrative Chinese market in the same open manner, then we need to do something about that. So I think we can increase our strategic capacity to act by just being more European, being more focused on rules and being more focused on markets and not less. I think that's a very, very important decision. The core edge conversation. And that's one that I tend to love to leave to the technical experts. The wording that I think makes sense is to say, right now it makes a difference. as long as our systems are going to be kind of layered on top of each other and not a fully fledged standalone 5G solution, there is going to be a difference. With a fully developed 5G ecosystem in the end, there is an opportunity for the computing to move towards the edge, because that increases the power on the outer rims of the network, which can allow for low latencies and allow for those applications to happen. That's that's what we want to see in the future, so that base stations become more vulnerable. Now, not every single base station, as Ian Levy puts it in his blog and from the NCSC in the UK, basically saying that there's going to be like mini antennas on top of lampposts out there. Not every single base station will have the same vulnerabilities, but we can safely say that we will see a different kind of architecture, and core functions will move towards the edge, and to really make that distinction will become more complex. But also true is, this is a complex technological matter, and I'm not going to try to put this in words and I'm not going to try to kind of figure out the exact way of where exactly could you mitigate, how could you put in controls that work. That's a question for those that deal with cybersecurity. But we can talk about the overall architecture and say there are greater vulnerabilities at the outside, so we need to think about the radio access network as well, which is, as you can see in the British decision, which is a perfect description of this. That's why there is a risk mitigation in the radio access network, because there is a clear understanding that this will become a more vulnerable part of the network. Otherwise, one could have said, well, 100% radio access network. So there's an acknowledgement that there is going to be a problem, and sometimes I'm not sure whether all the tech experts know how exactly it's going to pan out as well, but maybe that's just me being naive. Yeah, so maybe I'll leave it at that. Okay, there were many more questions. Maybe we should collect a few, Renaud.
Yes, we are going to do that. Regarding the technical issues, we can help on that, DigitalES, so whenever you want.
There you go.
Yes. I go
Thank you.
No problem. And what is fun in DigitalES is that this is the industry representation of the technological and telecom industry. So we are the telco industry, all of them in Spain, but also suppliers like Ericsson, Nokia, ZTE, and Huawei. So we have all these kind of debates inside our
I don't envy you at the moment.
You're right. So we are going to collect some more questions. And Alejandra, I think there is one here, one here, one here, and one here. So there are 4 questions that we are going to go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, Ms. Janka Oertel. For coming here and this sharing and so on. I have heard in the last days that...
I'm sorry to say that you need to say your name and your
I am Ignacio Ramos from the Universidad de Comillas, teaching regional studies Asia at ICADE, which is, for business and international relations. So, I was wondering, I heard yesterday that in the United States, there have been a significant step with regard to the collaboration with Huawei, which is in fact very much present everywhere in the States. So Huawei has a lot of technology already deployed on the States, not yet 5G technology, but many other things are being made by Huawei. This is already very much present there. I was wondering, I have heard that, whether you have some update on that, a significant, because people from the United States, especially, they are very practical. They are very practical people. I wonder also, if I understand well, you are somehow here and before in the UK on a mission, so to speak, to deliver a message to influential people here present. And somehow, I wonder whether we are trying, perhaps in the EU, to be more conscious and be more aware of values than the United States themselves, because they are very practical. They have been so since Deng Xiaoping reforms, much more than EU people on China. Yeah, so that whether we are representing them in terms of values and whether we are sure that the United States is there and won't change their position when it's convenient for them. And also regarding the coupling, I wonder whether in China there is a lot of fear. And the Communist Party is having a lot of fear, and that's why it's exerting a lot of control on its population and whatever it can. That is no doubt about it. But I also I'm doubtful whether this message to share with us this kind of fear, what is coming, and somehow painting the decoupling as a somehow reasonable way to walk, which is going to bring more poverty. Definitely, is going to be a massive punch against the development of global economy.
I think, if you don't mind, we could.
Yeah, whether we are, I don't know, whether this message of the coupling is not like being also sharing the same worries of the Communist Party, and rather than trying to have a more like smarter approach. I don't know, perhaps raising more.
I'm sorry. We need to jump to another question.
Last sentence. Rather than trying perhaps to collaborate with Huawei, but raising like the standards of that collaboration, like putting in some hurdles, but not using the ostrich strategy.
We are going to wrap up some questions and afterwards.
Yeah, just collect a few.
Yeah, because there is a lot. There is another question here on the third row, Alejandra. There is a first question here, another one there, and two more on the top, on the back. I mean.
Good morning. I'm Shani Perez Chen, PhD candidate, Salamanca University, and also a researcher at the Institute of Statecraft. And I've been researching about. I'm currently researching about China's influence operations, and because you refer to them as China using coercion, economic coercion. So I'm going to focus more on the geopolitical than on the technical. And you say that in Germany there is a currently debate and all political parties has expressed their views about 5G and Huawei involvement. Actually, Germany is lucky because I think in Spain we don't have this open discussion and debate. To my knowledge, no political party has positioned themselves. Well, in my experience in Spain, there is an open debate when it comes to critically speak about China. So, well, for instance, my university was attacked. I don't mean cyber attacked. I mean, it was victim of influence operations back in 2017, affecting freedom of speech and freedom in academia. So, my question is, since in other European countries there is this open debate, and how can civil society can contribute to this debate? Because at the end of the day, the decision is going to affect civil society and civil society's institutions. So how can civil society can contribute to this debate?
Okay, thank you for your question. There is one here, Andrés Ortega, please. And on the back.
Andrés Ortega, ACFR and Elcano Institute. To go beyond 5G, I think there are two issues, technological issues, which impact on the triangle US, China, and Europe. One is semiconductors, advanced semiconductors, in which I think the administration in the US is trying to close the tap to the Chinese. No? And there I think in Europe we're also in a strange situation. Mm-hmm. The other thing is web-based services, in which Europe is far behind the US, far behind China. And there also I think there are important things which are coming from China, no? Like Alibaba, or things which don't seem important but are important, like TikTok.
Okay, thank you very much. There are two more on the back. Elena?
Thank you, finally. Thanks, Janka, a lot. I am Elena Berruguete from Ericsson. Very interesting your approach. And leaving apart political issues, which must be discussed on political, let's say, environments. It was very interesting, the interpretation you made on the UK decision regarding the toolbox. I think it was quite surprising, the thing that it was adopted only 48 hours before Brexit came into force, which is very relevant, I would say. And regarding this limitation of 35% for high-risk vendors, you said that it applies, I understood, at least to mitigation rather than to diversity factors. So this, in your interpretation, could mean that it could be possible in any EU country to have a 5G network provided by only, let's say, 2 vendors, one of them achieving higher market share, of course, than even a 50%. Could that be possible in your understanding? Thank you.
There is also a question here. José Emilio Serra.
Okay, thank you. Janka, my name is José Emilio Serra from Schneider Electric, Spain. My question is about technology evolution and all these discussions you have inside Europe and with China and US. The question is there any discussion what technology not to develop? Are we going to develop every technology in full speed regarding basically intelligent artificial? And this could substitute this democracy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So if there is no more questions.
Maybe I take that round now, otherwise I will forget where I wanted to go.
It's a good batch.
So I'll take them in the order. So on the question of Huawei's presence in the US, so to be very, very clear, in the existing telecommunications infrastructure in the United States, Huawei has a presence only in rural providers at the moment, and that presence is being phased out. And that's done by incentives and by throwing money at the problem. Incentive is, for example, that you have a standing fund in which all of the mobile phone consumers are paying into basically in a percentage way that is used as a structural fund normally to supply network in areas where it's usually not profitable for operators to be. I mean, if it's in Iowa somewhere in the outside where it's really not very profitable to have a bunch of mobile antennas standing out there. This is where rural providers can then apply for funds and can receive some support. And this is, for example, now being regulated to say you can't apply for that support anymore if we build with Huawei technology. These are normal kind of regulatory ways of doing things if you're a market economy. So this is the situation that we face there on the ground. Huawei's presence in the US telecommunications infrastructure will shrink to close to zero over the next few years because there's zero incentive for operators to build it. And that's just the way this is structured at the moment. There has been a conflation of debates, of 2 debates usually in the US. One is the question of we don't want Huawei in our systems, and one is we can't sell to Huawei. These are 2 different things. One thing is you protect your networks, and that's the question where there's bipartisan unity, where there's no question within the government. This has been discussed since 2010-11. Congress is behind it. It's a very clear position to say, we don't want them in our networks, period. Now the question of, is Qualcomm semiconductors that we get there, are they going to be able in the future to sell to Huawei? Because obviously global supply chains go both ways. It's not just all of it is produced in China. China buys a lot from the US and buys a lot from Europe in terms of products as well that are then kind of combined in these very complex products in the end. That's a question that is more difficult because you can say from a national security perspective, Do you really need that to secure your systems, or do you want to slow the economic development of China down? Well, that becomes a different story, because then in the end, it's ruining a business for your companies as well. If you have companies that sell to China, that's a huge market and it's quite interesting. And if they're allowed to sell to China, then they would like to sell to China. So this is where we have the problems that we're facing, where we see more of that. So the entities listing was the best example of that, where there were limitations on what could be sold to Huawei. And also what can be kind of imported in the future. Now, it was always framed that to say we need to extend that period a little bit so that rural providers can still have software updates, etc., for the time being, and that we can still continue while this is going on. But there is no real decision, because we have the 4th extension now of a general license that was granted to Huawei as to be an exempt from that entities list. And this is something that where you see the struggles also within the US. This is not an easy decision, because in the end that one will cost money. And so it's not so easy to move forward with that. While excluding Huawei doesn't really cost money from the network infrastructure, forbidding companies to trade with them will. So and this is where you see it's also more complicated for the US. But that in return, really it's important to say there's not going to be this big turn in the US where in the end they're going to make this big trade deal with China and then all of their telecoms infrastructure is going to be built by Huawei. We're not going to see that. That is an absolutely implausible scenario, just looking at the network infrastructure that is there, looking at the consensus that we have. So I think it's really important to there has been a lot of this myth in the European debate that, and then in the end they're having that deal and we exclude Huawei and they won't then in the end, and so then we will be in a very difficult situation, and that's just not the case. It's really important to underline that. Is decoupling reasonable? No. Is it inevitable at the moment? I don't know. Because we're on that track at the moment, and it's really hard to stop because it emanates from both Beijing and Washington. There's actually more pull from Washington, from the business community to hold it back because they have no interest in it. It's really important for Europe to understand the underlying logic and to find ways to stop the process from a full fragmentation, but that's going to be very difficult in the future because you can already see that the political debates that we're having have an effect on supply chains and that there is a diversification of the market, and it could lead to even greater fragmentation, and that's something that we wouldn't be interested in, or that we are not interested in Europe, but it will be hard to get agency to really make it stop. So I think it's one thing to say we don't want decoupling, but if you look at what the companies are doing, then you say, well, we're at the stage where it's already starting to happen, and maybe in the end we don't want it, but then it's too late. Then it's already kind of happened. Very interesting, the point about Chinese influence operations. I think it's a very much under-discussed conversation in Europe in general. It's the question of how much political influence, how much societal influence, how much economic influence is already exerted. What we need to do is map this. We need to figure out what exactly is happening in each member state. We're the perfect prey in a way because we're so decentralized and fragmented. And I'm not only talking about the EU, I'm talking about like Germany as a federal state. Each university has absolute liberty to basically do what they want to do and conclude agreements with whom they want to conclude agreements. On the lower level, federal, the state level, there's delegations coming through, agreements are being signed, and it's really hard to keep track of what's going on. But that's our problem. That's not China's problem. That's our problem that we can't keep track.
Spain is exactly the same thing.
Yeah, and I think we need to just kind of be a bit smart about it and start mapping, start registering, and start just figuring out, because then we can also talk about, okay, what is really a problem and what is not. Because it could be that we are also exaggerating in some areas the actual problem that there is. So we need a solid empirical basis of what we're actually talking about, and I know that Merex is doing work on that in Berlin. Several other actors are trying to figure out, okay, what are the cases? We have a very, very good mapping in the Czech Republic. Chinfluence and Synopsys are doing excellent work there.
I'm actually working with Synopsys to do the mapping in Spain.
Perfect. And you have with Martin Haller the best partner that you can have, because there are just a few people that are doing this. The community is super small. And you see that poor China watchers have to cover everything from trade wars to nuclear weapons to North Korea most of the time. So we're all over the place. So it's really good that we have people investing in this. That's a plea to governments and industry from my side as well, this mapping exercise, what you need for that is human resources. You need people to do the mapping. That requires funds. So if there ever were good things to fund at the moment, well, that's definitely one. So just as a message out there to whoever may hear that message, I think this is a really important place to start from where we are. And then we can, on that empirical basis, say, okay, these are the measures that we can take, but then we can take them a bit more level-headed and less hysterical, but more like in a pragmatic way. Beyond 5G. The semiconductors business is a very interesting one at the moment because it is one where the market dynamic has led to a great dominance on the US side, and where it's really not that easy for the Chinese to catch up. On the other hand, it would be a mistake to assume that they can't in the long run if they want to. And you see the investment that is thrown at the problem. That industry is a key focus of the Chinese administration at the moment. We need to get semiconductors right, basically. That's what and they will struggle for a time because it's really not that easy. But they have the financial resources and they're attractive as a partner because of the financial resources. So I think this is something that where a solution can be found. What we're seeing from the US is this tug of war at the moment. There is a big crowd within the US administration and with the policy community that says, well, we need to just cut their supply off. We'll slow them down for good. We'll slow them down for a long time. This would be great. And then there's this other part that says, yeah, but this really, it will cost us money if we do, and we can't invest that money then anymore in our own spending. And if we don't have money to spend, then we're going to be less innovative. We're going to lose edge over the long run. And that debate is still ongoing. We have semiconductor industry and support industry in Europe as well. I think this is also an area in which we can think about smarter collaboration in Europe, about funds that could be liberated for development, for innovation, funds that are deliberately designed for failure as well, so that we can move ahead and that we can have more. So I think there is, money is not a problem in Europe normally. And so we could, if we would stop bickering about the 0.1 or 2 0 points, whatever percentages in the multi-annual financial framework for the EU, and start thinking about, okay, what is it that we really need to do? And if we want a powerful EU, then we will need to pay for it. And I'm saying that not addressed to this room, I'm saying this addressed to Berlin, that's a very important thing to do. Elena was, I think, right, over there. So the UK decision. I'm not a technology expert. Whether you can build secure networks with the existing providers minus the Chinese high-risk vendors or not is not a decision that I can take. I can just say that it's happening all over the world, and that I find it questionable that the United States is able to do this, and we say it will not be possible to do this in Europe. So just from that perspective of what we can see going on, we have with Samsung a third player in the market. We have a variety of other players that are kind of in core technology that can provide that. So it's just that we have these few companies that are doing the radio access network and that provide you with like the full spectrum of solutions. But in this whole context, there's a lot of players in this, and a lot of European and a lot of American players in this. So there is more diversity than it immediately sounds like when you think about the situation. But the US example, the Korean example, the Japanese example, the Australian example shows that there is a belief in those countries that they can build secure 5G networks with existing suppliers without high-risk vendors. And that's what I would say about that. So I think if we look at that, that should also be doable for Europe. And then the question of technology evolution. I think it's a super important and almost philosophical question to say what technology to develop and what not to develop. For me, facial recognition is one of those where I was a bit surprised that the EU wasn't more forceful in saying we need to put a stop on this for the time being, as long as we don't know how it's going to be used and how we're going to regulate it. This is going to fall to the member states again, which is going to make it more diverse again, is going to make it more complicated again now. I think that we can see that in the hands of authoritarian governments, these forms of technology can have dystopian consequences, and we need to acknowledge that. And I urge everyone to look into the Xinjiang documentation that exists a little bit more, what you can do with surveillance technology, if you really set your mind to it and if you have that intent, is not only concerning, it's horrifying. And so we really need to think about what are the chains that we want to put on this, because not everything that can be developed needs to be developed. And I think we can, was it Clearview AI, the case where they have, where they have gathered all that information and now they had a massive breach in their database. It shows you that, you can only be secure to a certain degree, and it will make things more complicated in the future. And I think Europe has learned a few lessons from the past, and GDPR is actually a very powerful tool on many areas, and we need to develop that further and think further and use our collective intelligence to think what are the things that what is the kind of world that we want to live in, and how do we want to have that shaped, this human-centric perspective that the Commission has put forward. As a China watcher, it's a bit funny because the Chinese Communist Party is always talking about people-centered approaches, and it reminds me, like the translation would remind me a bit of the Chinese version of this. This is not what is meant, but just as a side note, this is not something that we can claim as our own. Human-centered is human-centered, and depends on how you define that human. But I think in general, this is the right approach to say, we need tech that delivers for the people, and not that delivers for the companies only. And that should, if that's the guiding, if these are the goalposts that we put in, maybe we can find a proper way in this.
Okay, so it's 10:15. We are going to finish this session because we have to go to work now. It has been a very interesting debate with you, Janka, very highlighting. It's true that this is a multi-angle debate with mixed feelings, right? As you were saying, we don't like human rights violation and we like the free market, so we don't like protectionism. So it's so complex, right? And being equidistant in this topic, Europe, I understand, is because of the complexity. So thank you very much for your conference. Feel free to come to Spain whenever you feel. You are going to be always welcome in DigitalES for everything you need. So thank you very much. And
thank you all very much for coming this early.
Sure. And thank you very much to Isia.